I've been a gardener for the Hartwell Mansion for 5 years now. It wasn't the kind of job I ever thought I'd have, but life has a way of steering you into places you never expected. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows each other's business and nothing much ever changes. My mom raised me on her own, working long hours as a seamstress to make sure we had what we needed. She was tough but kind, the kind of person who'd give you her last dollar if it meant you'd be okay. Hard work isn't something I shy away from. I've always liked having something to do with my hands, whether it's fixing an old fence or planting a row of vegetables. There's something honest about it, something that clears your mind. I never needed much else. I'm 35 now, but I moved to this area when I was 30. My mom got sick, cancer, and I came here to take care of her. We didn't have anyone else, so it was just the two of us, like it always had been. I rented a small place nearby and spent my days driving her to appointments, cooking her meals, and sitting by her side when the treatments left her too weak to get up. She passed away 6 months later. It hit me hard, but I stayed, maybe because I didn't have anywhere else to go, or maybe because I didn't know what else to do. I liked the quiet here, the way the fields stretched out for miles, and the hills rolled up against the sky. I took on jobs at first, painting fences, fixing roofs, anything to pay the bills. And then I heard about the Hartwell Mansion. They were looking for a gardener, someone who could handle the grounds and wasn't afraid of a little isolation. Sounded perfect to me. People warned me about the place before I even started. That's the haunted mansion, they said, shaking their heads. You don't want to mess with that. I didn't think much of it at the time. Ghost stories don't pay the bills, and I'd never been one to scare easy. The mansion is up on a hill, surrounded by tall iron gates and trees so old they look like they've been there since the dawn of time. The first time I saw it, I thought it was beautiful, in a strange way. The kind of beauty that makes you stop and stare, even if it unsettles you a little. Plants here die faster than a pot of boiling water dries up, but it's my job to keep the grounds looking respectable. Nobody expects perfect roses, but I can at least keep them from turning into black sticks overnight. I've learned to live with the strange things. A stoic attitude helps. If you jump at every creak in the floorboards or eerie shadow flickering through the fog, you won't last a day. That's what O'Reilly, the human caretaker, told me when I first started. O'Reilly's been here longer than I have, longer than anyone who's still breathing. He's wiry, with a face like an old tree, tough but somehow still warm. He's good company when we're both on the clock, though we mostly work in different parts of the mansion. He takes care of the inside, I take care of the outside. And the mansion, well, it takes care of itself. It didn't take long for me to meet the others. The first was Lady L, the resident fortune teller and former herbalist. Her crystal ball sits on a tall wooden pedestal in the library, wedged between dusty tomes and half-melted candles. I remember stumbling upon her on my second day, thinking it was some kind of tacky decor, and then her voice echoed through the room. Well, another victim of Hartwell's peculiar hiring process, she said. I nearly dropped the watering can. Her face appeared in the swirling mist inside the crystal ball. She was sharp-featured and elegant, with eyes that sparkled like a stormy sea. She sounded like she'd swallowed a thesaurus, always using big words and dramatic flourishes. Oh, it's not much of a life being stuck in this glass prison, but it's better than the alternative. Don't touch the curtains. They're hideous. I've been trapped here for centuries, and the decor hasn't improved one bit. She wasn't wrong about the decor. Every room in the mansion looks like it's been ripped from a dozen different eras, none of which match. Then there's Headless Jack. He's the kind of guy who could probably win you over at a bar, if you weren't, headless. Jack pops up when you least expect him. You'll be pruning a hedge or sweeping a hallway, and suddenly, there he is, carrying his head under one arm. Hey, Tom, careful with those rose bushes. They bite back, he said one evening, his head blinking and giving me a wink. I'll admit, the first time I saw him, I froze. But Jack's got a way of putting people at ease. He's sarcastic and quick-witted, like a comedian who happens to just be missing something. Last but not least is Count Bernard. He's technically a vampire, though I've never seen him drink anything except the thick red liquid in his goblet. Could be wine, could be blood. I don't ask. Bernard spends most of his time in the dining room, where he critiques the cook's meals like a snobby food critic. This stew is an abomination. Do you call this seasoning? I've seen better efforts from the rats in the cellar, he announced one evening as I walked past the doorway. The cook, a cranky old ghost named Frank, slammed his spoon down. You can't even eat it, Bernard. How the hell would you? The bickering is endless but oddly comforting. During the day, the mansion opens to tourists. They pay good money for Hartwell's haunted experience, which includes fake fog machines, spooky soundtracks, and jump scares. The tourists have no idea that the haunts are real. They think Lady L's crystal ball is a clever trick, and that Headless Jack is a paid actor. Jack loves playing into it. He'll pop up behind a tour group, his head tucked under one arm, and give them a little bow. The screams echo all the way to the garden. Bernard, on the other hand, despises the tourists and hides whenever they're around. Humans. Vapid creatures with no sense of decorum, he mutters with disgust. The only place off limits to the tours, and everyone else, is the West Wing. No one talks about the West Wing. It's the one part of the mansion I've never seen. They didn't lock it up, but they might as well have. Heavy velvet ropes stretch across the entrance, and old wooden screens block off the hallway leading to it. O'Reilly told me not to ask about it. I don't pry. I don't need to. The West Wing was the master section of the house, his bedroom, his private study, and who knows what else. When he died, they sectioned it off, and no one's been inside since. Not even the ghosts. Still, the West Wing looms. It's a constant presence in the mansion, a secret hidden behind ropes and screens. And like all good secrets, it's only a matter of time before someone tries to uncover it. There's a rule about the Hartwell mansion: if you die here, you stay here forever. I didn't believe it at first. O'Reilly told me on my third day, matter of fact, as if he were reminding me to lock the greenhouse doors. He tightened his grip on the mop he was holding and explained it plainly. Once you're here, you become part of the place, and it doesn't let go. I thought he was joking, until I met Daisy. Now, Daisy's a dog. Or she used to be. Now she's a skeleton of what must have been a big, proud German shepherd. I think her bones click and clatter when she walks, but she still carries herself like she's alive. Her tail wags when she's happy, even though it's just a ring of vertebrae. We met on my first day. I was planting daisies near the fountain, trying to make the place look less like the set of a horror movie. I'd barely gotten the last bulb in the ground when she came bounding up out of nowhere. She dug up the whole patch in seconds, dirt flying everywhere. "You are a menace," I told her, shaking my head. But I couldn't stay mad at her, not when she sat there wagging her bony tail like she'd done me a favor. I named her Daisy right then and there, and she's been my companion ever since. The lure around the mansion is that once you're inside, the outside. The world forgets about you. At least, that's what the ghosts say. Some of them swear they've tried to leave, only to find themselves right back at the front door. It's not just ghosts, creatures live here too. Some as friendly as Jack and Daisy, and others, not so much. I've learned to keep my head down, stick to my work, and avoid certain parts of the house after dark. One of the things O'Reilly told me was to never wander alone at night. Daytime was fine, but nighttime was different. Most of the residents were harmless, but there were a few you would not want to run into after dark. I've had a few close calls. Once, I was trimming the hedges near the back gate when I heard heavy footsteps behind me. When I turned around, nothing was there, but the roses nearby were crushed, as if something had barreled through them. Daisy stood in front of me, her bony frame stiff as a board. She growled a low rattle that echoed in the quiet garden. "You know what? Let's call it a day," I said, backing away. Daisy stuck close to my side all the way back to the main path. The mansion runs on a mix of mystery and money. There's a family fund that pays O'Reilly and me, though I've never met anyone who claims to be a Hartwell. It's enough to keep the place standing and pay for basic upkeep, but the real money comes from the supernatural tours. During the day, the house feels almost normal, bustling with visitors snapping photos and marveling at the special effects. Most think Daisy is some kind of animatronic, a clever trick for the show, and I let them believe it. The rest of the mansion's operation is obscure. O'Reilly handles the books, but even he shrugs when I ask where the money comes from. There's something unsettling about that, but I try not to think about it too much. The mansion has a way of making you accept things you'd normally question. Daisy keeps me sane. I talk to her while I work, partly to pass the time and partly because she listens better than most people. "You know, these flowers don't stand a chance." "I don't know, I'll give it a shot. Maybe they'll last the week," I said one morning, crouched beside a bush that had already started to wilt. Daisy sat beside me, tilting her bony head as if she understood. Her jaw opened and closed in what I could only describe as a pantomime of a dog's panting. "Yeah, you know what? You're right. They're doomed." She followed me around the garden, her bones clinking softly with each step. Sometimes, I'd toss her a stick to see what she'd do. She'd pick it up, shake it like a real dog, and drop it at my feet. "You're a good girl," I said, scratching the air where her ears used to be. Her tail wagged a rhythmic clatter against the cobblestones. Daisy's more than just a companion, she's a reminder that not everything in this place is grim or dangerous. Some things, even in a cursed mansion, can still bring a little light. Of course, not everyone here is as friendly as Daisy. There are things in the mansion I haven't met, and I don't want to. O'Reilly calls them the quiet ones, though he won't say much beyond that. He always insisted the best way to avoid trouble was to keep your head down and focus on the work. That was the only way to stay on their good side, if they even had one. So, I focus on the plants, the grounds, and Daisy. The rest I leave to the mansion. It's better that way, for now. The West Wing stays roped off. The residents keep to their routines, and I do my best to keep the garden alive, one doomed flower bed at a time. It was late when the last group of kids finally left the mansion. A school trip, they called it, but it felt more like babysitting a pack of wild animals. They screamed at every creak of the floorboards, pounded on the old furniture, and left sticky fingerprints on nearly every surface. By the time the tour guide ushered them out, the place felt more alive than the ghosts themselves. O'Reilly and I stayed back to clean up, as we always did after the tours. The mansion needed to be ready for the next day, and neither of us liked leaving. Things half done, Daisy, exhausted from the chaos, had curled up by the fire in the library. She looked peaceful, her bony frame rising and falling as if she were dreaming of chasing rabbits. I made a pot of coffee in the kitchen. It was the least I could do for O'Reilly after a day like this. His mop leaned against the wall, and he sat in an old armchair near the hearth, his shoulders slouched from years of hard work. I brought him a steaming cup and settled into the chair across from him. The library was quiet now, the only sounds the crackling fire and the occasional rattle of Daisy's bones as she shifted in her sleep. The warmth of the flames felt good after the chill of the day. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting the heat spread through me. My mind wandered, as it often did during quiet moments like this. The West Wing, always sectioned off and looming in the mansion's shadow, crept into my thoughts. It had been on my mind for months now, the unanswered questions gnawing at me. Everyone whispered about it, but no one ever seemed to say much directly. The West Wing was more than just an abandoned part of the mansion, it felt like the heart of the curse that held this place together. It was where the ghosts came from, where the strange creatures seemed drawn to, and where Daisy never strayed. I'd seen her stop at the velvet ropes before, her bones stiffening as if she was afraid to go inside. I'd heard the rumors, of course. Everyone who worked here had. The West Wing was said to be the most dangerous part of the mansion, a place where even the ghosts feared to linger. The air itself was said to feel heavier there, as if pressing against you, daring you to step inside. The stories about the mansion's old master always seemed tied to it, though the details varied depending on who you asked. Some said he was a madman consumed by his own genius. Others said he was cursed long before the mansion ever became what it is now. But the version that stuck with me the most was the one about his fiancée. The master of the house had been a brilliant inventor, a man of extraordinary talent and ambition. He'd studied abroad at a prestigious university, earning the kind of education that only the wealthiest and most gifted could afford. When he returned, he was eager to share his inventions with the world. He had plans, blueprints for machines that could change industries, revolutionize the way people lived. He trusted his fiancée with these plans, sharing them in confidence, believing in her love and loyalty. But she betrayed him. She gave his blueprints to another man, not only breaking his heart but destroying everything he'd worked for. The inventions were stolen, the credit taken by someone else, and his name was tarnished, his reputation ruined. According to this version of the story, the betrayal consumed him with rage. In his fury, he set fire to the West Wing of the mansion, destroying everything he'd once held dear. The fire gutted the place, leaving it charred and blackened, a skeleton of what it once was. The West Wing remained that way, untouched and abandoned. The curse seemed to center there, spreading its influence throughout the mansion but never leaving its source. There were stories about what happened to those who dared enter. Some were said to come out changed, their minds broken or their bodies marked by some terrible fate. Others, they didn't come out at all. The rumors were grim, people setting fires, jumping from windows, falling ill with inexplicable diseases. No case was ever officially linked to the mansion. The authorities couldn't prove anything, and most didn't want to dig too deep. But those who worked here, who lived here, knew the truth. Daisy stirred by the fire, her tail giving a slow wag. For a moment, I wondered if she'd known the master of the house. The thought gave me pause. Daisy was a mystery in her own right, a loyal companion who seemed as much a part of the mansion as the walls themselves. She'd been here long before me, long before O'Reilly even, and yet she never wandered far from the living spaces. The West Wing was off limits to her, as it was to the rest of us. O'Reilly once said that some places are better left alone, and I was starting to understand what he meant. The mansion had its secrets, and while curiosity pulled at me, I knew better than to push too far. The fire crackled softly as I finished my coffee, the warmth settling deep in my bones. O'Reilly set his empty cup on the small table beside him and stretched, the weariness of the day etched into his movements. Daisy shifted again, her tail giving another faint wag before she settled back into stillness. We closed up for the night, blocking the doors and turning out the lights. The mansion was quiet again, the kind of stillness that settles in once the day's chaos has passed. I didn't think much about the West Wing after that night by the fire. O'Reilly's stories were chilling, sure, But they felt just like that, stories. At least, that's what I told myself. And then the ghost hunters came. It was a group of 4, 2 men and 2 women, all in their early 20s. They came in during the last tour of the day, carrying cameras and an EMF detectors like they were stepping onto a Hollywood set. One of them, a tall, cocky guy with slick back hair, stood out immediately. He spoke loudly, cracking jokes and acting like he owned the place. I could tell his friends were embarrassed. They kept apologizing to the tour guide, trying to keep him in line. His girlfriend, a quiet woman with long dark hair, seemed especially nervous, like she was second-guessing the whole trip. When the group reached the West Wing, the guy did their usual spiel, warning everyone not to cross the ropes. The area was forbidden, and even the spirits avoided it. They explained, lowering their voices for dramatic effect. That was all the tall guy needed to hear. Later that evening, after the tour had ended and the group was supposed to be gathering their things to leave, I spotted him slipping away. He ducked under the ropes and disappeared into the West Wing, a flashlight in his hand. His girlfriend called after him, but he waved her off, laughing, telling her he'd be back. After 10 minutes, I figured he'd take a look, scare himself, and come running back. But he was gone longer than I expected. His friends started getting worried, calling his name and pacing near the ropes. Just as they were about to go after him, he reappeared, but he wasn't the same. He didn't say a word, didn't crack a joke, didn't even make eye contact. His face was pale, and his hands shook as he handed the flashlight back to one of his friends. When they asked him what happened, he just mumbled that they needed to go and started walking toward the exit. The group left quickly, their earlier excitement replaced by uneasy silence. It stuck with me, the way he looked, like he'd seen something he couldn't explain, something he wished he hadn't. But I still didn't believe the stories. Not fully. Not until I read the news a few weeks later. The same man had jumped from a second-story window of his apartment. He didn't die, but he broke his arm pretty badly. The article said he'd been acting strange in the days leading up to it, locking himself in his room and refusing to talk to anyone. The man who'd snuck into the forbidden part of the house. And up in the news. I started looking at the place a little differently. Still, the day-to-day didn't change much. O'Reilly and I opened up the mansion as usual. It was another school trip, this time with younger kids. They couldn't have been more than, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old, all dressed in matching school uniforms that made them look like a row of tiny penguins. Her voice quivered with disbelief. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting Lucy to suddenly appear. The group of kids, who had been so full of energy earlier, were now sitting in a huddled cluster, whispering to each other with nervous glances toward the West Wing. O'Reilly was already moving, his expression serious. "We'll check the mansion top to bottom," he said, his deep voice steady, though there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. No stone unturned. I nodded and moved to the front, trying to keep calm despite the weight settling on my chest. Lucy was just a little girl. There was no way she could have just disappeared, not in the middle of the mansion. But the feeling in my gut said otherwise. I glanced toward the West Wing, its shadow looming at the edge of the hall. "You don't think she went in there, do you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but O'Reilly heard me. He didn't answer right away, just looked over at me for a long moment. His weathered face was unreadable, but I could tell he was considering it. "Get the group outside," he said, his voice clipped. "We'll search inside." He turned away and walked toward the kitchen, presumably to grab the keys to the West Wing's entrance. I quickly ushered the kids out of the hall, trying to keep them calm. Their wide eyes were still glued to the mansion's darkened corners, and I couldn't blame them. The place felt different now, heavier. As we stepped outside, I couldn't help but glance back at the looming silhouette of the West Wing. O'Reilly and I moved toward the back door. We didn't speak, but the tension between us was palpable. We both knew where Lucy might have gone. The West Wing wasn't just another part of the mansion, it was the forbidden part, where all the old stories and secrets gathered. And now, it seemed, Lucy had wandered right into the heart of it. The door creaked as O'Reilly unlocked it, and the smell of old wood and dust rushed out to meet us. The air inside was stifling, thick with the weight of years of neglect. We moved cautiously, our footsteps muffled on the carpeted floors. The hallways seemed darker here, even with the faint light filtering in from the cracks in the windows. I could feel the weight of the mansion pressing in on us, and as we passed each door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. "Lucy!" O'Reilly called, his voice breaking the silence. It echoed down the hall, but there was no answer. We pushed forward, moving deeper into the West Wing. The temperature dropped as we approached the old library, where the air was thick with something off. I glanced at O'Reilly, who stopped and looked toward the shadows beyond the shelves. "I don't like this," he muttered. "I can feel it, something's wrong." We stepped carefully toward the doorway, and as we did, the lights flickered, barely enough to notice, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I reached for the door, my hand trembling slightly as I pushed it open. The sight that greeted us made my blood run cold. Lucy was standing in the middle of the room, her daffodil still clutched tightly in her hand. She wasn't moving, her face pale and her eyes wide, fixed on something we couldn't see. "Lucy," I breathed, stepping forward. She didn't respond. It was like she was frozen in place. O'Reilly's voice came low and firm, "Get her out of here, now." I reached for her, my heart racing, and as soon as my fingers touched her shoulder, I felt it. The air shifted, the temperature dropping even further. And from the corners of my vision, I saw it, a shadow, too fast to track, flitting just out of reach. A cold whisper ran down my spine. "You shouldn't have come here." I grabbed Lucy's hand and pulled her away, but as I did, I could feel the pressure building, pushing against us, as though the mansion itself didn't want us to leave. We rushed out of the room, and as soon as we crossed the threshold into the hall, the oppressive feeling lifted. The air lightened. Lucy blinked, as though snapping out of a trance, and looked up at me with wide eyes. "What happened?" I asked, but she just shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I saw something," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Something dark." O'Reilly stepped in, his face hard. "We're leaving. Now." And that was the end of it. We took Lucy outside and made sure she was with her group, but the fear that had gripped me didn't go away. The mansion's secret, the one that lurked in the West Wing, was more than just stories. It was real. "Proper preparation, Count Bernard," he said, his voice low but tinged with a hint of amusement. His eyes flicked from me to the swirling mist in Lady Lever's crystal ball, then back to me again, sizing me up. "But then, I suppose we all have our quirks." Lady Lever's sharp gaze flickered toward Bernard, her expression unreadable, but she didn't respond. I could feel the tension between them, the unspoken history. I wasn't interested in their cryptic back and forth, though. Lucy was out there. In the West Wing. And I had to get her before whatever lay hidden there found her first. "Do you have something to help me?" I asked, my voice more urgent than I intended. Bernard's lips curled into a thin smile. "Maybe. But don't expect any simple answers." He extended the small glass jar toward me, its contents glinting in the dim light. Inside was what appeared to be a piece of shattered mirror. The glass was sharp, jagged, and the edges shimmered with an eerie, unnatural glow. "What is it?" I asked, instinctively taking the jar from his hand. "A shard from the mirror," he said, his tone almost reverent. "It's a key to navigating the West Wing's labyrinth. But it comes with a price." His smile faded, replaced by something darker. "It'll show you the path, but it will also reveal what you fear most." I looked at the shard, feeling a cold shiver crawl up my spine. Fear. That was the last thing I needed right now. "You sure this will work?" I asked, more to myself than to Bernard. Lady Lever's voice echoed again, as though she'd been waiting for me to ask. "The mirror shows the way, but remember, it only reveals truths in reflection. The West Wing will twist your mind if you let it. You must hold your ground. The fear it brings can break even the strongest." I nodded slowly, more to myself than to her, then turned toward the door. "Thank you," I said, my voice gruff, before stepping out into the hall with Daisy trailing behind me. I didn't wait to hear more cryptic warnings. The West Wing wasn't far. I could already feel the weight of it pressing against me, pulling me toward its darkness. With each step, the temperature dropped, the air thickening. And as I approached the door, the shard of glass in my hand pulsed with a faint light, almost as though it was alive. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping into the shadowed hall. The hallway seemed endless, stretching out in every direction like a maze that twisted and turned. The walls were lined with old portraits, faces that seemed to watch, their eyes following my every move. The air smelled stale, like forgotten things. Daisy whined softly beside me, her ears flat against her head. Even she could feel it, the weight of the curse that hung in the air. I glanced down at the shard in my hand. It glowed brighter now, its edges sharp and glimmering like moonlight. I held it up, watching as the light shifted, casting odd, distorted shadows on the walls. The crystal seemed to guide me, its light flickering and shifting in response to my movement. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The shadows felt wrong. Alive, even. My own reflection seemed to warp in the darkened glass of the frames around me. I could almost hear whispers, too faint to make out but unmistakable in their presence. And then, I saw her. Lucy. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her yellow raincoat a stark contrast against the oppressive dark. She wasn't moving. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something, or someone, that I couldn't see. I called her name, but she didn't respond. I took a step forward, my breath coming faster. The shard pulsed again, and I felt a cold hand grip my chest, pulling me into the shadows. The hall stretched farther than it should have. I took another step, and the wall seemed to move, closing in around me. A laugh echoed in the distance, a low, mocking sound that made my heart race. I had to reach her. There was no turning back. Daisy growled softly beside me, her fur bristling as she sensed the presence that lurked in the dark. I pushed forward, my hand tightening around the shard. The closer I got to Lucy, the more the air seemed to thicken, the oppressive presence growing stronger, darker. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just behind her. Tall, looming. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, a cruel, knowing gleam. It watched me, and the laughter filled the air, louder now, a distorted echo that chilled me to the bone. "Lucy!" I shouted, but the words felt weak, swallowed by the darkness. She didn't move. She didn't even blink. I knew then that the West Wing wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing thing. And it wanted us, wanted our fear, our souls. I stepped forward, gripping the shard with everything I had. The figure in the shadows took a step forward too, and I could feel the air grow colder, heavier. I had to act, and I had to act fast. What would you do next in this moment? Should we try to confront the figure or find another way to reach Lucy? Seemed to loom over us, their cold, cracked surfaces more ominous than I remembered. The air was thick with a strange energy, a pulse that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. The once familiar mansion now felt alien, as though the West Wing existed in a space outside of time. Daisy let out a low growl, her bones creaking under the strain of the tension. She sensed it too. The darkness. The curse. I glanced down at the jar in my hand. The willows inside pulsed faintly, their tiny blue lights flickering like distant stars. The first one hovered in front of me, waiting, as though it could feel the weight of the decision before me. "Guess we'll see if this works," I muttered, more to myself than to Daisy. I uncorked the jar, and as I did, the first willow darted out like a bolt of blue light, its small form glowing brighter as it floated ahead, guiding the way. It danced through the air with a strange elegance, its flickers creating brief trails of light that seemed to shimmer in the shadows. I followed it, keeping close to Daisy as we stepped into the West Wing. The halls were silent, the air colder here, and the walls seemed to close in tighter the deeper we went. The further we walked, the more the darkness pressed in, like a living thing, waiting to swallow us whole. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, the oppressive silence making every footstep sound like an echo from another world. The willow in front of us flickered erratically, leading us toward a winding staircase at the end of the hall. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling upward, but no matter how far we climbed, the light from the willow never reached the top. The air grew even heavier, thick with an almost suffocating presence. Daisy's growl was louder now, more insistent, and I could feel her body tense as if she were bracing for something unseen. The willow, too, was glowing brighter, as though reacting to the growing tension in the air. I reached out, clutching the jar tighter, ready to release the second willow. But just before I could, I heard something. A soft sound, footsteps, too light to be human, and too heavy to be a shadow. I turned sharply, my heart racing. In the dark, just at the edge of the stairs, I saw a figure. Pale, almost transparent, but unmistakable. Lucy. She was standing there, motionless, her yellow raincoat glowing faintly in the dim light. Her head was turned to one side, and she stared at me with unblinking eyes, eyes that seemed too wide, too empty. Her small hands hung limply at her sides. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Lucy?" I called softly, stepping toward her. My voice barely broke the silence, swallowed up by the dark. She didn't respond. She didn't even blink. I could feel the presence growing behind me, thickening. There was something else here, something that wasn't Lucy, but was wearing her skin. The willow flickered violently, sending out strange, erratic bursts of light. It was as if it were trying to warn me. I reached out a hand to her, but before I could get any closer, a low whisper filled the air. "You shouldn't have come." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The very walls trembled as if the mansion itself was warning me. Lucy's eyes flashed, dark and hollow, and she tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. I stepped back instinctively, my mind racing. It was a trap. Whatever had taken Lucy was wearing her like a mask. I needed to act fast. I glanced at the jar again. The second willow was still inside, waiting. I had to use it now. But what would I be facing? And could I use the willows wisely enough to get her, and myself, out alive? Time. The plants that once stood proud and vibrant had withered into twisted, blackened husks, their skeletal branches reaching toward the ceiling like outstretched hands. The air here was heavy, suffused with a strange, stale scent that reminded me of old decay. Yet, there was something unsettlingly serene about it, as if the room had been frozen in time, caught between life and death. Daisy's growls had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to press in from all sides. We stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the place settling around us. The willow's faint blue light flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own, bending and stretching unnaturally along the floor and walls. I felt a chill creep up my spine. The blue glow of the willow flared once more, snapping my attention back to it. It moved toward the far end of the room, where a shadowed figure stood at the center of the dead garden, its back to us. "Lucy?" I whispered, though my voice felt small in the cavernous space. The figure didn't respond. I stepped forward, my boots echoing on the cracked marble floor, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Daisy stayed close by, her bones rattling slightly with each step. As I neared the figure, I could feel the tension in the air growing thicker, the temperature dropping with each passing second. The willows had stopped moving ahead, now hovering beside me, their faint glow casting an otherworldly light over the figure. The figure turned slowly, its face obscured by shadow. For a moment, I thought it was Lucy, until I saw her eyes. Hollow. Empty. It was the same thing that had been following me, that strange presence I could feel lurking in the depths of the West Wing. A chill ran through me as the figure stepped forward. It was wearing Lucy's face, but it wasn't her. I could feel it in the air, the distortion. The way the shadow clung to the edges of its form, making it seem not quite real. It was like a shell, a vessel for something far darker, far more sinister. The creature smiled, a twisted, unnatural curve of the lips, and the air grew colder still. "You've come for her, haven't you?" the thing whispered, its voice a low, eerie rasp. "But she's not the one you should be saving." Before I could react, the figure reached out with long, twisted fingers, its touch icy against the air. The willows flared, their light fighting against the shadow, but it was weakening. The curse that thrived in the West Wing was stronger than I'd realized. "Lucy's not here anymore," it continued, its voice carrying the weight of something ancient, something that had been trapped in the mansion for far too long. "And you can't save her. Not from what she's become." I felt the familiar weight of panic rising in my chest. The creature's words gnawed at me, pulling at my resolve. It was trying to get inside my head, to make me doubt. But I couldn't falter, not now. I glanced down at Daisy, who stood rigid at my side, her bones trembling with barely contained energy. I could feel the pull of the curse on me, but I had one advantage: I wasn't alone. "Lucy is still in there," I said, my voice steady despite the fear that churned in my stomach. "And I'm not leaving without her." The creature's smile widened, its face twisting into something even darker, its eyes gleaming with malice. "Then you will die with her," it hissed. At that, it lunged toward me with an unnatural speed, its shadowed form blurring as it reached out to strike. I barely had time to react, but the willows, growing brighter now, shot forward, their light bursting out like a shield against the darkness. The creature recoiled, hissing as the light pushed against it, burning its form with a faint, high-pitched wail. I didn't wait for it to recover. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the second willow, releasing it into the air. It darted toward the creature, the light from both willows clashing against the darkness. The creature shrieked, its form flickering, distorting like smoke in the wind. For a moment, I thought it was going to disappear, but then, with a final, deafening screech, it dissipated into the shadows, leaving only the faint scent of something burned behind. I stood there, breathing heavily, the echoes of the creature's wail fading into the walls. The willows hovered around me, their glow flickering like tiny stars, still pulsing faintly. Daisy didn't move, her eyes scanning the room warily, but I could tell she was ready for whatever came next. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep this up. The West Wing was vast, and Lucy could still be anywhere. But I had to keep going. I couldn't stop now. "Let's find you, Lucy," I whispered. "I'm not giving up on you." With the willows at my side, I took the first step forward, my resolve hardening with each passing moment. I'd been holding my breath for an eternity. My heart was pounding in my chest, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. I slowly released Daisy's tail, the tension in her body easing as well. The monster was gone, at least for now. But I knew better than to think I was safe. The West Wing was full of dangers like that, and I had no idea what else lurked in the shadows. I glanced down at Daisy, who was still crouched low, her eyes fixed on the doorway the creature had passed through. "We need to move," I whispered, my voice hoarse. The longer we stayed here, the more likely we were to run into something worse. With a final glance at the spot where the monster had disappeared, I stood and moved cautiously toward the far end of the room, keeping low and out of sight. The willows, still glowing faintly in my hand, began to pulse again, as if urging us forward. I followed their lead, stepping lightly over the cracked floor, careful not to make a sound. Daisy stayed close, her body tense but alert. We passed the angel statue, its eyes seeming to follow us as we moved. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching, judging. But there was no time to dwell on it. We had a mission, and Lucy was still out there. The hallway ahead was dark, the only light coming from the flickering willows. As we moved deeper into the west wing, I could feel the air growing colder, the oppressive atmosphere thickening around us. The walls seemed to close in, and the faint whisper of something, voices, maybe, echoed through the corridors. "Stay close," I murmured to Daisy. I could feel her breath on my leg as she kept pace with me, her presence a constant, grounding reminder that I wasn't alone in this. I reached the end of the hallway, where another set of double doors loomed ahead, their surfaces cracked and weathered with age. The willows drifted towards them, the light growing brighter as they approached. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the door handle. This was it. Whatever waited beyond these doors might be the end of the road, or the beginning of something far worse. I took a deep breath, praying silently once again, and pushed the door open. The sound of the hinges creaked loudly, breaking the heavy silence of the west wing. Beyond the door was a vast, open chamber, larger than anything we'd seen so far. The space was empty, save for the jagged remains of what looked like a large altar in the center, its stone surface chipped and cracked. And there, standing at the far end of the room, was Lucy. She stood motionless, her back to me, the dim light from the willows casting a faint glow over her form. Her long hair fell in disheveled strands around her shoulders, and her clothes, tattered and stained, hung loosely from her frame. Her posture was unnaturally still, as though frozen in place. "Lucy?" I called softly, stepping into the room. My heart leaped into my throat as I took another step forward. She didn't move. I glanced down at Daisy, whose stance had grown more protective, a low growl rumbling from her throat. The air felt heavy, as if the room itself were holding its breath. I took another step, and that's when I noticed it, the strange, dark aura surrounding Lucy. It wasn't just the shadows of the room. It was something deeper, something dark that seemed to twist and writhe just beneath her skin. My blood ran cold. "Lucy?" I said again, this time louder. "It's me, we're here to—" Before I could finish, she turned slowly, her head swiveling with a jerky, unnatural motion. Her eyes locked onto mine, but they weren't Lucy's eyes. They were empty, black as night, with no trace of recognition. And then she smiled. It was not the warm, welcoming smile I remembered. This smile was cold, dark, twisted, and filled with malice. "You should have stayed away," her voice rasped, distorted, as though coming from somewhere far deeper than her throat. I felt the willows pulse violently in my hand, their glow flickering erratically in response to the dark energy radiating from Lucy. Daisy's growl intensified, her stance growing more defensive as she stepped forward. "Lucy, please," I said, my voice shaking despite myself. "I don't want to hurt you. We can still get out of here. You don't have to." But Lucy cut me off with a laugh, sharp and cold. It wasn't her laugh. It was something darker, something that chilled me to the bone. "I'm already gone," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising tension in the room. "There's no coming back." The air around her shimmered, and the shadows seemed to bend and stretch, reaching for me as though the darkness itself was alive. Daisy barked loudly, her voice echoing in the chamber, but Lucy didn't flinch. Instead, her smile widened, and she took a slow, deliberate step toward me. I couldn't just stand there. I had to act. I yanked the jar of willows from my pocket, unscrewing the lid in one swift motion. The 3 tiny lights inside flared brighter, their glow intensifying as I held them aloft between us. The air crackled, as if the willows were preparing to battle the very darkness that had taken hold of Lucy. "Stay back," I warned, my voice firmer than I felt. I didn't know if the willows would be enough, but I had no choice but to trust them. Lucy stopped in her tracks, her head tilting to one side as if studying me. "You think those lights will save you," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "You can't fight what's already inside me." The willows pulsed again, brighter than ever, and for a moment, it felt like the room was holding its breath. I took a step forward. "I don't care what's inside you. I'm not leaving without you." And with that, I released the first willow. Close, her steps muffled but her body tense, as if she sensed the growing unease in the air. The wall seemed to close in around us, the faint flickering of the willow's light the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft scuff of my boots and the occasional rattle of Daisy's paws. The hallway twisted and turned, its structure growing more disorienting with each step. Paintings continued to line the walls, their subjects still frozen in their eternal screams, their gazes unblinking and unrelenting. The air grew heavier, the sense of being watched suffocating. Every time I dared glance at a painting, I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, the lifeless eyes following my every move. Daisy's growl rumbled low in her throat, barely audible, but I could feel her unease. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, trying to steady my nerves. Each flicker of light from the willows seemed to cast long, twisted shadows, stretching across the walls like fingers reaching for us. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in this place wanted us to be lost, to wander forever through its endless corridors. We continued forward, the sound of Daisy's paws clicking softly on the floor, the only indication that we weren't completely alone in this oppressive silence. At the end of the hallway, the faint glow of the willows illuminated a heavy wooden door, dark and weathered with age. The willow that had been guiding us floated toward the door, its light pulsing faintly, urging us forward. I stopped just before the door, hesitation creeping in. This felt like a point of no return, but I couldn't turn back now. Lucy was out there, and I had to find her. "Daisy," I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. She looked up at me, her eyes full of understanding and trust. I nodded at her and reached for the door. The heavy door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing through the corridor. Beyond it was a large room, dimly lit by the soft glow of the willows. The air was thick with dust, and the scent of decay hung in the air, a bitter reminder of the years that had passed since this place had seen life. As I stepped inside, I couldn't help but feel the weight of something watching us from the shadows. The room was sparse, with only a few old pieces of furniture scattered about, an overturned chair here, a broken table there. But in the center of the room, standing tall and unnaturally still, was Lucy. Her back was turned to me, her posture rigid, as if frozen in place. Her long hair hung in tangled strands, and her clothes were torn and stained with dirt. She hadn't moved since I last saw her, but something was different now. There was an unnatural stillness to her, a coldness that radiated from her form. I stepped forward cautiously, calling her name once more. "Lucy? It's me, it's..." But before I could finish, her head snapped around, her eyes locking onto mine with a cold, empty stare. The blackness that filled her eyes was unsettling, and her lips curled into a twisted, mocking smile. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice low and distorted, as if it were coming from somewhere deep within her. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't Lucy anymore. The person standing before me was something else, something twisted and dark. "You think you can save me?" she continued, her voice becoming sharper, more menacing. "There's nothing left to save." I felt the willows pulse in my pocket, their glow flickering faintly in response to the rising tension. Daisy growled low, her hackles raised as she stepped forward, ready to protect me. "Lucy, please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You don't have to do this. We can still get out of here. I can help you." But Lucy didn't respond. Instead, her smile grew wider, and her hands reached up, twisting in unnatural angles, as if the very air around her was bending to her will. I could feel the room closing in, the walls seeming to shift and warp as her presence expanded, her dark aura pushing against the space around us. A chill ran down my spine, and I knew then that I was running out of time. I took a step back, my hand reaching into my pocket for the last remaining willow. It glowed brightly in my palm, its light fighting against the encroaching darkness. "Stay back," I warned, my voice more forceful now. I couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. Whatever had taken Lucy had to be confronted now, before it consumed her entirely. Daisy barked, her voice filled with urgency. The willow flickered brightly in my hand, its glow illuminating the shadows that seemed to grow darker with every passing second. With a quick motion, I hurled the willow towards Lucy. The light shot through the air, its glow flaring as it made contact with the darkness around Lucy. For a moment, the room seemed to shake, and a low, guttural sound filled the space, a sound that made my skin crawl. Lucy's body jerked violently, her form contorting unnaturally as the light battled against the shadows. But the darkness fought back, growing stronger, pulling at her with an unrelenting force. "Lucy!" I screamed, my heart breaking at the sight of her struggling against the pull of the darkness. I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. The willow's light flickered one last time before it dimmed completely, and the shadows closed in around her once more. The room fell silent, and I knew then that we were not alone. Wasn't just a test of knowledge. It was a test of patience, of nerve, and of understanding. The quiet ones thrived on fear and hesitation. If I let them play with me, I would lose. I had to stay calm, focus on the riddle, and not give them the satisfaction of seeing me falter. The eyes, hundreds of them, shifted in unison, like a wave moving through the darkness, their faint reflections bouncing off the water, making the entire ballroom seem alive with their movement. I could feel their gaze on me, probing, waiting for me to make a wrong move. The voice echoed again, its tone growing heavier, pressing down on my chest. "Answer me, or stay trapped forever in the dark." I swallowed, my throat dry, but I didn't speak yet. Instead, I looked around, scanning for any hint or clue that could guide me. The riddle might be nonsensical, but it had to have a pattern, a logic. The words themselves were thick with meaning, but the key was in the rhythm of the speech, the strange cadence in the voice. Suddenly, I remembered something Lady Levern had said, her words now clear in my mind: "The ones who ask riddles want more than an answer. They want you to understand." This wasn't a battle of wits, it was a game of perspectives. I needed to think differently. I stood taller, my voice steady as I called out into the darkness. What is it you want to know? There was a silence for a long moment, the eyes all staring at me, unmoving now. The voice returned, softer, almost intrigued. You may pass, if you answer my riddle. I nodded, taking a deep breath. What is your riddle? I asked again, quieter now, my mind focused on the task at hand. There was a long pause, and then the voice broke the silence with a new riddle. I have keys but open no locks. I have space but no room. You can enter, but you cannot leave. What am I? I stood still for a moment, processing the riddle. The riddle wasn't just about thinking, it was about seeing past the obvious, about understanding what was being said between the lines. I glanced around, my gaze landing on the broken mirrors and the floating debris. I thought about the symbols, the sounds, the spaces. The answer was clear. A keyboard, I said softly. It's a keyboard. The eyes blinked, a ripple of acknowledgement passing through the murky water. A deep rumbling sound echoed through the space, like the shifting of something immense, and then the voice spoke again, slower, calmer this time. You have answered correctly. You may pass. The eyes began to fade into the darkness, the pressure lifting from the room as the walls seemed to release their tension. The water calmed, the strange ink-like red stain in the far corner beginning to dissipate, as if the answer had drained the malevolent energy from the room. Daisy let out a soft whine, her tail wagging cautiously. I took a step forward, my heart still racing, but relieved. The eyes were gone, and the weight of the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. We moved forward, deeper into the ballroom. The air still had the dampness of water, but the feeling of being trapped, of being watched, had faded. We were still under the lake, but now there was a way forward. Lucy, I whispered, as I moved through the eerie, waterlogged ballroom. I'm coming for you. The room seemed to stretch ahead, endless in its darkness, but something had shifted. The path ahead was no longer clouded with uncertainty. I was one step closer. But I couldn't let my guard down yet. Jack! Jack, I need you! The words echoed down the hallway, bouncing off the walls, but there was no immediate answer. The willow floated motionless, its pale blue glow pulsing softly, as if sensing the stillness of the moment. I looked down at Daisy, who was staring at the debris, her growl rising low in her throat. Her senses were sharper than mine, and if something was wrong, she'd be the first to know. I gripped the flashlight tighter and took another step toward the rubble, scanning for any sign of movement. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to give in to frustration, I heard it, a faint rustling behind me. My heart skipped a beat as I spun around, expecting something to emerge from the shadows. But there was only Jack, stepping from the darkness, his expression unreadable. You called? His voice was low, almost as if he'd been waiting just out of sight for the right moment. I exhaled sharply, relief flooding through me, though it was quickly followed by the weight of the situation. Yeah. I'm stuck. The willow led me here, but the path's blocked, and I don't know what to do next. Jack glanced at the rubble and then back at me, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the problem. This isn't just rubble, he muttered, kneeling down and brushing a hand over the stone debris. It's part of the structure. Something's happened here. This path is intentionally closed off. I frowned, feeling a growing sense of dread. You're saying it's not just a collapse? Jack stood up, dusting off his hands, and looked around the hallway with a strange intensity. No. It's a barrier. Something wants to keep you from going forward. But if we're gonna get through this, we'll need more than luck. His words were unsettling, but not surprising. I'd expected the mansion to throw more obstacles in my path. I had no choice but to keep moving, to keep looking for Lucy. The walls, the paintings, the monsters, it was all part of this twisted game. But now, with Jack's sudden appearance, I wasn't sure if he was here to help, or to make things worse. You got any ideas? I asked, trying to mask the unease creeping into my voice. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched near the rubble, inspecting it closely. Daisy took a few steps forward, her tail still low, but she didn't seem as tense now that Jack was here. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a small tool that looked like a crowbar. I've got a few tricks, Jack said, his voice a little lighter, though I could tell he was focused. But if we're gonna get through this, we need to be careful. We can't just barge through and expect it to open up for us. I nodded. What do we need to do? Jack glanced at me, his eyes flickering with something unreadable. There's something hidden in the walls here, some kind of mechanism. We need to find it and activate it, but we'll have to be patient. The mansion doesn't like to give things away easily. I wasn't sure what he meant by hidden mechanisms, but I didn't have the luxury of questioning him. Lucy was still out there, somewhere beyond this barrier. I stepped up next to Jack and watched as he worked, pulling back layers of rubble and examining the stones carefully. The tension in the air was thick, and the silence was oppressive. The willow's soft pulse was the only sound in the stillness. As Jack continued his work, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Minutes passed, but the feeling of unease only deepened. Just as I was about to ask Jack if he'd found anything, he paused. His fingers brushed over a small symbol carved into one of the stones. It was barely visible, hidden among the cracks, but it was unmistakable. "This is it," Jack muttered. "The activation point. Give me a second." I stood still, waiting as Jack began to manipulate the symbol, tracing it with his fingers. The air grew colder, and I could feel a shift, as if something deep within the mansion was waking up. I gripped the flashlight tighter, scanning the surroundings for any signs of movement. Then, with a faint click, the rubble shifted. The wall groaned as if coming to life, and a section of it began to slide open, revealing a narrow passage beyond. The path was clear. Jack stood back, wiping his brow. "After you," he said with a half-smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. He was just as on edge as I was. I hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward, Daisy by my side. The narrow passageway stretched ahead, its darkness swallowing the light from my flashlight. I could feel the weight of everything closing in again, the pressure of the mansion pushing down on me. But now, at least, there was a way forward. "Lucy," I whispered, my resolve hardening. "I'm coming for you." With that, I moved forward, trusting Jack to follow. The path ahead was unclear, but the feeling of being watched had never been stronger. Whatever the mansion had in store, I was ready to face it. Any moment. But the stillness in the air, the oppressive silence, made it clear that something wasn't right. It was too perfect, too untouched, almost as if the room had been preserved in a delicate bubble, suspended between time and something else, something darker. Daisy's growl broke the silence, her eyes fixed on the bed. I followed her gaze, and my heart skipped. Beneath the pristine covers, something shifted, a subtle movement, a faint rustling. The air felt colder around me, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally. I stepped forward cautiously, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Lucy?" I called softly, the name hanging in the stillness. There was no response, just the weight of the room pressing down on me. Daisy growled again, her low, rumbling sound echoing in the silence. I moved closer to the bed, my fingers tingling with a strange energy as I reached out to pull back the covers. The bed felt cold, unnaturally so, and as I lifted the fabric, my stomach churned. There, lying motionless under the sheets, was Lucy. But it wasn't the Lucy I remembered. Her body was pale, her eyes closed, but there was something off, something wrong in the way she lay there, so still, so lifeless. A faint shadow seemed to cling to her, a dark aura that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I knelt beside her, my heart racing. "Lucy," I whispered, my voice trembling as I reached out to shake her gently. "Lucy, wake up." There was no response, no movement. My fingers brushed her skin, cold as ice, and the unease grew into something more, a deep, gnawing terror that crept into my bones. It was as if she wasn't just asleep, but trapped, something holding her in place, something far beyond the physical. I looked around the room, feeling the oppressive weight of the curse Jack had warned me about. The shadows seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, watching. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something else, another figure standing in the doorway. My breath caught in my throat as I turned. A woman stood there, her face obscured by a veil, her figure tall and slender. Her presence seemed to distort the air around her, making the room feel smaller, suffocating. She didn't speak, just watched, her eyes hidden behind the veil. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken tension. I could feel her power, the unnatural force emanating from her like a dark tide. And then, she spoke, her voice soft, like a whisper in the back of my mind. "You should not have come." Her words were barely audible, but they felt like a command, an unspoken rule. I stood frozen, not knowing whether to run or stay, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. "Lucy," I said again, desperation creeping into my voice. "What have you done to her?" The woman didn't move, didn't respond, but her presence seemed to grow stronger, pressing down on me. Daisy growled low at my side, her stance defensive, but I could see the unease in her eyes too. She knew we were outmatched here. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, the woman spoke again, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "You should leave now," she said, her voice growing colder. "Or you'll be trapped here with the rest of them." A shiver ran down my spine. The warning was clear, but I wasn't leaving without Lucy. I couldn't. "No," I said firmly, swallowing the fear clawing at my throat. "I'm not leaving without her." The woman didn't flinch, didn't seem to care, but I could feel something shift in the air, something ancient and dangerous. The room seemed to pulse, the shadow swirling, growing darker, as if the very walls were closing in. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice slipping into my mind like a thread of silk. "You can't save her. She is already lost." I gripped the flashlight in my hand tighter, my heart pounding in my chest. I'll find a way. The woman didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough, her silence, her power, her warning. But I wouldn't let that stop me. I would find a way. I had to. Daisy's growl grew louder, more insistent, and I knew then that the time had come to act. Whatever this woman was, whatever dark force held Lucy in its grip, I couldn't stand here and let it win. I took a deep breath, stepping closer to the bed, reaching out toward Lucy once more. This time, I would fight. Whispered, her voice barely audible over the heavy silence in the room. Her hands gripped the beam beneath her, knuckles white with fear, but her eyes never left the demon, who towered over her, unmoving and unnaturally still. Lucy! I shouted, stepping forward, my heart racing as I took in the monstrous figure in front of her. Get down from there. It's not worth it. But she didn't move, didn't even blink. It was as if the demon's presence had rooted her in place, her mind clouded by something dark, something more powerful than any fear she'd ever known. I felt a surge of panic rising in me. I had to act, before it was too late. I reached for the flashlights, but the darkness at the edges of the room felt like it was pulling me in, slowing my every movement. The demon's smile widened, a grotesque expression of triumph, and its eyes glowed like molten gold. It tilted its head, watching me, savoring the moment as if it had all the time in the world. The air grew thicker, oppressive, and I could hear Lucy sobbing now, her voice strangled with guilt and confusion. I didn't mean to, she sobbed. I didn't mean to, but it's so strong. It's so hard to fight. I could hear her, feel the sorrow in her voice, and the desperation clawing at my chest. This wasn't just fear, it was something far darker, a power that had seeped into her soul, twisting her, making her believe she couldn't escape. Lucy, look at me! I yelled, desperation lacing my voice. I moved closer, though every step felt like it took twice as long. The demon didn't react, its smile never faltering, as if it was waiting for me to make a mistake. And then, with a sudden burst of energy, I found myself at the edge of the chasm. The beam stretched far in front of me, impossibly narrow, and below, there was nothing but the abyss. The demon didn't seem to notice me anymore, its attention fixed solely on Lucy. Lucy, you're stronger than this, I called, my voice cutting through the heavy tension in the air. I know you are. Don't let it control you. Fight it. She looked up at me then, her tear-filled eyes locking onto mine. For a brief moment, it was as if the curse around her had cracked, a brief glimmer of the old Lucy shining through. But just as quickly, the darkness returned, clouding her expression. I can't. I'm not strong enough, she whispered, her voice breaking. It'll kill us both. You are strong enough, I said, my voice steady now, a sudden clarity washing over me. You're not alone. We'll fight this together. The demon's growl rumbled through the room, a low, vibrating sound that shook the walls. But I didn't look away from Lucy. This wasn't just about saving her, it was about breaking the hold this place had on her, on all of us. I stepped forward onto the beam, the wood creaking under my weight. Just hold on, I called out. I'm coming for you. As I moved, I felt the pressure of the room building, the darkness pressing in on me. The air thickened with every step, the demon's presence looming like a wall I couldn't break through. But I wasn't going to let it stop me. And then, in a moment of reckless clarity, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the daffodil, the one I'd found in the room earlier. It wasn't much, but I knew it meant something to Lucy. It was a symbol of hope, of life, something that could counteract the overwhelming darkness. Lucy! I shouted again, holding out the flower. This is for you. It's a promise. We'll get through this. The moment I extended it toward her, the demon's grin faltered. A flash of light pulsed through the air, and I felt the weight on my chest lighten, just for a moment. But that moment was enough. Lucy's eyes flickered, her grip on the beam loosening slightly. She looked down at the flower, and then back at me, her expression wavering between fear and determination. I don't want to be trapped here, she whispered. Then come with me, I said, taking another step forward. We can escape this place. Together. The room trembled as the demon let out a deep, guttural snarl. But Lucy didn't move. For a second, everything went still. And then, slowly, her hand stretched toward the flower. In a perfect formation, their soft glow illuminating the dark, crumbling hallway ahead. The warmth from the willows was comforting, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat and chaos that surrounded us. The fire flickered ominously at the edges, but the glowing trail they created seemed to hold it back, just enough to give us a chance. Stay close, Lucy, I said, my voice a little steadier now. I could feel the weight of her fear, her trembling body against me, but I refused to let go. Every step felt like an eternity, the ground shaking beneath us as the air grew thicker with each passing moment. We rounded another corner, the willows leading us forward, and I caught a glimpse of something, an opening. The dim light from the willows reflected off the shattered windows ahead, revealing a door at the far end of the hall. My heart quickened. It had to be a way out. I shifted Lucy in my arms, making sure she was still clinging to me tightly. "We're almost there," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. The air was growing heavier, and the willow's glow flickered slightly, as if even they were struggling against the malevolent forces in the mansion. Daisy stayed by our side, her low growls unwavering, her keen senses alert to any movement. I could feel the demon's presence behind us, still lingering in the shadows, its eyes never leaving us. It was patient, too patient. But I wasn't going to let it take us. We reached the door, and I hesitated for a moment, my fingers brushing the cold metal of the handle. The faint light from the willows flickered once more, as if urging me forward. I pulled the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit room on the other side. It was a stark contrast to the chaos we'd left behind. I stepped inside, keeping Lucy close, and as we crossed the threshold, the heavy weight in the air seemed to lift, just slightly. The walls of the room were lined with shelves, but it was the far corner that caught my eye. There, behind a curtain, I could see a faint light. Without thinking, I moved toward it, hoping that this would be the escape we so desperately needed. The willows hovered around us, their glow bright and unwavering. But then, the air shifted. The door slammed shut behind us, the sound reverberating through the room like a thunderclap. The light from the willows flickered violently, and I felt the familiar presence of the demon once again, creeping into the edges of my mind. It was too close. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. The door behind us had disappeared, replaced by a stone wall. There was no way out. And then, from the darkness, the demon's voice echoed, deep and mocking. "You think you've escaped me?" it purred, its voice vibrating through my bones. "This place is mine. There is no escape." Lucy's grip tightened on me, her breath quick and shallow. "Tom, what do we do?" I looked down at her, my mind racing. The willows had given us hope, but now it felt like we were running out of time. But as I stood there, facing the endless darkness in the room, I realized something. We'd come this far, and we weren't alone. We had each other. And we had Daisy. We weren't going to let this place swallow us whole. I stepped forward, pushing Lucy gently behind me, and faced the demon. "This isn't over," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We'll find a way out. And you're not taking her." The demon didn't respond immediately, but I could feel its presence looming, filling the room with an oppressive weight. It was waiting for us to falter, to break. But I wasn't going to give it that satisfaction. Daisy barked again, the sharp sound cutting through the tension, and I felt the willows pulse stronger, their light pushing back against the darkness. We weren't done yet. Every crack, every door, and every hidden passage. The mansion seemed to fight against us, as if it didn't want to be contained, but O'Reilly, Bernard, and I pushed on. Lady L's crystal ball remained a constant presence, its soft hum providing us with guidance and a sense of purpose. Despite the chaos, the mysterious energy of the mansion began to settle, as though it was waiting for something, or someone, to break the peace we'd created. The renovations were taxing, and there were moments when I wondered if we were just buying time. But the truth was, we had no other choice. We couldn't let whatever lurked within those walls escape again. One late afternoon, as I sat with Lucy in the garden, watching the shadows stretch across the cobblestones, I felt a strange weight lift from my chest. The house was silent, unnaturally so. There was no rumble in the air, no shifting of the walls. For the first time in weeks, the mansion felt almost calm. "Do you think it's over?" Lucy asked, her voice quiet as she picked at the grass beneath her. I glanced over at her, noticing the shadows in her eyes had faded somewhat. The ordeal had clearly affected her, but she was strong, stronger than she gave herself credit for. "I don't know," I said honestly. "But I think for now, we're safe." The light of the setting sun cast a golden hue over the garden, and I could feel a new chapter beginning to unfold. The mansion would always be a place of mystery, of danger, but we had come through the worst of it. The danger was sealed away, for now. Lucy shifted beside me, looking up at the mansion with a mix of curiosity and fear. "Do you think we'll ever really understand what happened in there?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with a kind of wonder that I hadn't expected from her. I shook my head slowly. "Some things are better left in the dark." Lucy seemed to ponder this for a moment, her gaze far off in the distance. "I think I understand," she said finally, her voice firming up with newfound resolve. "Sometimes, the things we can't explain are the things that keep us moving forward." I smiled at her, impressed by her maturity. "Exactly. The important thing is that we're moving forward." Daisy let out a small bark from her spot beside us, her tail wagging lazily. As we sat in the garden, the golden light slowly fading into the deep blue of twilight, I felt a strange peace settle over me. Whatever secrets the mansion held, we had faced them and survived. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we might just have a chance at something resembling normalcy. But as the stars began to appear above, and the shadows deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't truly the end. Some stories don't end with a clean conclusion. Some things are just waiting, patiently, for their next chapter. I finished planting the last bulb, the soil settling around it like a quiet promise. The day's light began to fade, leaving behind a peaceful, still evening. The mansion stood as it always had, imposing yet now holding a strange sense of calm. Its walls whispered secrets, ones I'd rather not hear again, but for now, it felt like there was a quiet truce between us and the house. Daisy stretched, letting out a soft huff as she rolled onto her back, her paws pawing at the cool evening air. I smiled at her, the sound of her bones rattling oddly comforting. The world felt less heavy with her by my side. I stood, wiping my hands on my pants, and took one last look at the mansion. Despite its dark history, its looming walls, and the things we'd left buried inside, there was something beautiful about it, something that tugged at me to stay. "Let's go inside, girl," I muttered to Daisy, who gave me one last look before trotting after me. The mansion was still full of life, familiar and strange all at once. The ghostly inhabitants, their quirks and antics, felt less threatening now, almost like they were just part of the furniture. Headless Jack's unpredictable appearances, Lady L's constant critiques, they didn't faze me like they once did. I walked through the grand doors, the familiar creak of the old wood a comfort now. The house was quieter tonight, its usual hum of energy now tempered with a heavy peace. As I made my way to the sitting room, I passed by the hallway where Lucy and I had once stood, staring down that demon in the west wing. The memory was still fresh, vivid, but I was no longer haunted by it. The fear that had once gripped me in that space had melted away, replaced by something else, maybe acceptance, or even understanding. I didn't know what the future held for the mansion, or if its darkness would ever truly fade. But one thing was clear, we had survived. And for tonight, that was enough.